This is the first in a three-part lecture on ecology. This first one's going to be on population ecology. To begin though, ecology in general is the study of abiotic and biotic factors and how those interact. You guys defined biotic and abiotic factors in lab already this quarter when you were up on Seaholm Hill. Biotic factors meaning living things and abiotic meaning non-living things. So this truly is big picture biology. We're able to see the interaction of these. There are different levels of ecology though that you can study. You can study populations or you could study ecosystems. And so the first lecture that we're going to do here is on populations. And then we'll jump up to the ecosystem level and then we'll look at human impact. Okay, so today for population ecology, what we end up looking at is one population over time and how that population is doing in its environment. Now, when you talk about population ecology, you can talk about organisms growing in a couple of different ways. You can have J-shaped curves. So here's your population on your y-axis, and here's time that's increasing, and you can see this is truly exponential growth. This is probably what a lot of your duckweed populations looked like in lab. You have another option though. You can have J-shaped growth that then levels off. And what we call that leveling off is carrying capacity. And carrying capacity basically is the spot where it's the maximum number of individuals that that environment can hold. And the thing to think about with carrying capacity is this carrying capacity can change, and so we're going to be talking about that a little later. Okay, so these are idealized curves. They don't usually look this perfect, as you noticed when you guys did your duckweed experiment. Alternative versions of this, okay, so a more realistic population that goes through J-shaped growth and then levels off, there's going to be a lot of kind of noise around the carrying capacity. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that populations change from one season to the next, and even if they're at carrying capacity, that is shifting constantly. So we look at the average or the mean for carrying capacity. It also means that in order to determine the health of a population, you really have to take a long-term perspective, and that truly is going to give you a better picture of what's happening with that population. There are other realistic curves that can occur here too, sort of this J-shaped curve, and what happens when organisms exceed carrying capacity, sometimes one of the things that can happen is a crash, and sometimes there's a new leveling off, or sometimes there's a crash and extinction. And so there definitely are alternatives to these idealized curves. Okay, so I've asked you guys to learn about density-dependent and independent reduction factors, and that's a long, cumbersome statement, but essentially what it is are reduction factors are things that cause populations to level off. So those would be those downward arrows. So density dependent, things like predation and limiting factors and competition, symbioses, so all of those are density dependent. In other words, it depends on the number of individuals within a population. To contrast that, independent variables are things like natural disasters, anthropogenic causes like logging, habitat destruction. Those are density dependent, independent, and both dependent and independent contribute to leveling populations off. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some of these density dependent examples. Let's look at things like the exploitation category, which looks at parasitism or consumers. So let's draw an idealized curve. With exploitation, essentially what happens is one organism is using the other to its advantage, and so for the organism that it's benefiting, the relationship is benefiting, for example, a parasite would benefit and the host would not benefit. And so how those affect carrying capacity over the long term is parasites decrease the fitness of individuals. On a broader scale, they can lower the carrying capacity of that whole population. And the fact that this parasite is able to find a consistent host can increase the population and carrying capacity of that organism. And this is the pattern you find, this up and down arrow or plus and minus relationship that happens with all exploitation relationships. So let's take a look at competition next. And again, we're going to do a lot more with this in class. With competition, it's actually something that lowers both organisms involved, populations, and possibly carrying capacity. So with competition, it's actually a negative where anytime you have niche overlap, you're going to have two different species competing with one another, and that competition brings down the population of both, and long-term can affect carrying capacity if it's a consistent relationship. Commensalism is somewhat interesting. It is something where one organism benefits and the other has no net effect. Okay, so plus 0. Okay, so that's how that looks like on these curves. Now, what's interesting is that when you have organisms interacting with each other through exploitation, through competition, especially those first two that we looked at, you can have something called coevolution. So over time, natural selection, produces more fit populations, right? And so you can have species exerting pressure on each other to change over time, and that is coevolution. So some examples of coevolution that your book gives you are, for instance, this mimicry with defense adaptation. So the monarch butterfly is toxic for predators, and so there are other butterflies that have mimicked the coloration patterns even though they aren't toxic. You can have this example of a behavioral adaptation that's selected through natural selection, and what happens in these instances is that behaviorally they are stronger. With these behavioral changes that they make, they're less likely to die or be exploited. So in this case, what you've got is goshawk attack success rate, right? And so you can see that pigeons do very poorly when they're on their own, but they can confuse their predators when they flock in groups. Okay, so we also want to go ahead and look at competition a little bit more closely. Competition is something that is very, very common in the world, and so it's something that we should look at. It's also really interesting that it ties back in with coevolution, ties in with natural selection. When you think about competition, we said that it was a negative, and really how organisms can get around that and bolster their populations are through things like symbioses, like mutualisms or parasitisms, or through what we're going to call niche partitioning, or maybe you've heard of it as resource partitioning. So here's an example of resource partitioning that happens in the Pacific Northwest. So in this image you have two different types of barnacles. You have the smaller version high up on the rocks, and that's something that you can find, like if you go down to Larrabee State Park, you can actually see that these are higher up in the intertidal, and then you have a larger version down in the lower tide line. And there's a reason for this. if you can imagine, these are both barnacles, and so the niche overlap is pretty darn high. They live in the same area, they eat the same foods, they're physiologically similar to one another. Now, in this case, bigger is better, and so these guys are able to outcompete the smaller species. So what happens is when their juveniles randomly settle out in these lower portions, they're outcompeted and they die. So how do these guys survive is the question. Well, what they do is they, using natural selection, they have an adaptation where the door on their shells closes a little bit tighter than these guys, which means that they can stay wet longer. This is the tide line, right? So the tide comes in and the tide goes out. So obviously these guys are out of the tide longer than these. So there's less feeding that's done, but they're able to stay wet enough to survive. They are smaller, but they are living. And so they're living in almost complete niche overlap, but they've carved out this new space. They're dividing the resource of food and water. And through that adaptation, they're able to do that. Now, if the big ones settle up there, they die out because they dry out. So, the intertidal is actually a great place to go ahead and look at competition. Competition is extremely fierce in the intertidal. And if you go at low tide, I want you to pay close attention to these lines of division. As you move towards your water line, you'll transition from one species to the next, to the next, to the next. And those lines that you see are where intense competition is occurring. And the only reason they're able to survive these two, which are both types of barnacles, is because of niche partitioning, because of that adaptation that the smaller barnacles have. Okay, that completes our time on population ecology.